What happens when a man known for never backing down suddenly finds himself outmaneuvered on the world stage? At a massive rally in Budapest, Prime Minister Viktor Orbán branded George Soros an enemy of the state. And just 22 seconds later, Soros's legal team fired back with a $100 million lawsuit that is now shaking the continent. The square wasn't packed with international cameras. No global press pool was invited. It was supposed to be a purely national display of power in Budapest's Heroes Square. The air was thick with nationalism, the crowd a sea of red, white, and green flags, the speakers blaring patriotic anthems. For those gathered, it felt like another evening where Viktor Orbán would take the stage and fire off familiar lines to a crowd that already adored him. But then something different happened. A cell phone caught it, just a 20-second clip. Grainy, shaky, the kind you'd scroll past online until the audio makes you stop. Orbán, gripping the lectern with both hands, leaned forward and roared it, a sentence aimed squarely at George Soros, delivered with that mix of populist fury and calculated grievance he has become known for. Soros is the architect of our troubles, he thundered. He uses his dark money to flood our homeland with migrants, to undermine our Christian culture. He is an enemy of the people, and he should face charges for his crimes against the nation. The crowd erupted in a massive cheer, a wave of applause washing over the square. But the clip cut off there, leaving only the echo of Orbán's words bouncing across European servers. By morning, the hashtag was everywhere. Millions had already watched it, dissected it, reshared it. And then, 22 seconds later, George Soros's team dropped a bomb. Not a tweet, not a press release demanding an apology. A legal filing, a $100 million defamation lawsuit against Viktor Orbán, filed in the High Court of London, time-stamped and signed. It felt impossible. The clip hadn't even finished its viral journey. Yet here was Soros's international legal team moving with chilling precision, as if they'd been standing by with their finger on the trigger. The timing made people stop in their tracks. Commentators on Sky News and France 24 couldn't believe it. Was it even real? How had they acted so quickly? In Berlin, a political host muttered on air, "This isn't a reaction. This is a trap. Soros has been waiting for this." Across Europe, the conversation shifted. Suddenly, the story wasn't about Orbán's accusation. It was about Soros's response. And here's where things got interesting. The footage spread further, but so did the sense that something larger was in play. It wasn't just one man taking offense at another. It was a question of truth, state power, and the cost of reckless words in international politics. At a bistro in Lyon, a man named Pierre Dubois pushed his coffee aside and told a reporter, "Look, I have no love for billionaires meddling in politics, but if a national leader can just call someone an enemy of the state with no proof, then what's left? Words must have meaning." His friend across the table, shaking his head, replied, "Yes, but Orbán's always said stuff like that. Why is this one different?" And that was the spark. That was the moment when people realized something wasn't business as usual. Because this wasn't a Twitter war. This wasn't two politicians lobbing insults from a safe distance. This was legal paperwork, judges, and real consequences, challenging a sovereign leader with international law. The more the story grew, the more people leaned in. Some were fascinated by the speed, how ready Soros's team seemed. Others speculated that this was the plan all along. Let Orbán talk until he crossed a specific legal line, and then hit back with a lawsuit that couldn't be brushed off. Outside the Sorbonne in Paris, a young law student was interviewed. She smiled nervously and said, "It's kind of brilliant." They waited for the perfect moment. They knew he couldn't resist, and the second he said it, they had the documents ready. It's not just about money, it's about proving that state-sponsored lies have a price. 4 years, Orbán and Soros had been locked in a strange orbit, two Hungarian-born men on opposite sides of a global ideological battle. But this moment felt different. It was sharp, immediate, and charged with the weight of something bigger than a feud. And as the clip kept circulating, as the lawsuit headlines rolled across every channel, the question wasn't just who would win in court. It was what this fight said about Europe itself, about accountability, the way leaders use their words, and whether truth still had any standing against the power of the state. But the real shock came next when Soros's legal team revealed just how far ahead they had been planning this move. The lawsuit wasn't some vague threat tossed around on television. It was real, it was filed, and the timing was so exact that people didn't know whether to call it strategy or destiny. The Budapest rally clip had just begun its journey online when reporters in London received the official document. George Soros versus Viktor Orbán. Claim, defamation, damages sought in 100 million. The figure itself was enough to make jaws drop. It caused a message again. This wasn't about irritation or pride. This was about impact. A head of government had accused a private citizen of treasonous crimes on a public stage for political gain, and Soros wasn't going to let it slide. In Brussels, a panel on a morning news show went quiet for several seconds after reading the first page live on air. Then one commentator, a former prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, said bluntly, "This is surgical. They didn't scramble this together. They were waiting." This is Soros saying, enough. Across the continent, people were glued to their phones. Social feeds lit up with the PDF of the complaint, where Soros's lawyers laid out their argument with calm, pointed language. It wasn't angry or petty, it was cold, precise, like a chess master moving a piece they'd been holding back for months. And then came the statement. Standing outside the Royal Courts of Justice in London, Soros's lead counsel, Julian Thorne, addressed a wall of microphones. He wore a dark navy suit, his tone clipped, informal. Words have weight. When a head of government uses his platform to spread dangerous falsehoods about a private citizen, with the intent to damage his reputation and incite public animosity, that is not politics. It is defamation. We have filed this lawsuit to hold Mr. Orbán and his government accountable for these repeated lies, and we will see this case through in court. A reporter shouted a question, but Thorne only gave one more line. This is not about settling personal scores. This is about the truth. That sentence landed like a punch. In offices and homes, people repeated it. This is about the truth. For supporters of open society, it was a rallying cry. For skeptics, it was at least a moment to pause. Meanwhile, Orbán's rally clip was being rewatched in slow motion. His words weren't vague, they were specific. Enemy of the people, crimes against the nation. Legal experts explained why that mattered. Those were direct accusations of criminal conduct without evidence, made in a public forum, exactly the kind of statement that could be considered defamatory under English law. But there was something else, something that made the story even more electric. Reporters soon learned that the filing had been prepared days earlier. In fact, a journalist from Der Spiegel claimed a source within Soros's Open Society Foundations told them the documents were finalized more than 2 weeks before the Budapest rally, which meant Soros's team hadn't just reacted, they had anticipated. They knew Orbán couldn't resist taking another shot, and they built their case in advance, waiting for the spark. At a coffee shop in Vienna, 2 women argued over it while scrolling through their phones. He walked right into it, one said. They baited him without even baiting him. Just waited. Her friend shook her head. No, he baited himself. He always says stuff like that. They just finally called his bluff. And that was the conversation happening everywhere. Was this strategy or inevitability? Either way, it didn't matter. The lawsuit was filed, the statement was public, and Europe was watching. At the Sorbonne, a CNN crew captured footage of law students reading the complaint aloud like a script. One of them leaned back and said, "This is going to be in textbooks one day. It's about whether words have limits, even for a prime minister." Meanwhile, Orbán's allies tried to laugh it off. A government spokesman on Hungary's state television, M1, said, "This is ridiculous. It's just another politically motivated attack, a way for Soros to interfere in our national sovereignty." But even as he spoke, the host interrupted. "But this is an actual lawsuit in London. This isn't politics, this is court." That interruption shifted the energy. For the first time, it wasn't Orbán setting the narrative. It was Soros. And the contrast between the fiery rhetoric of Orbán on a rally stage and the cold professional filing from Soros's legal team couldn't have been clearer. But if people thought the filing itself was shocking, they hadn't yet seen the depth of planning that went into it. By the time the lawsuit made its way across every news ticker in the world, people started asking the same question. How could Soros's team have been so fast? You don't file a €100 million case in the time it takes to pour a cup of coffee. This had been in the works. Somewhere behind closed doors, lawyers and advisors had been building this moment for months. In a quiet, modern office overlooking the Thames in London, the work had been taking shape long before Orbán walked onto that Budapest stage. The team wasn't a massive war room, it was a handful of elite international attorneys, legal researchers, and strategists. The walls were covered in printouts of international case law, precedents, and highlighted quotes from Orbán's past speeches in government-sponsored anti-Soros billboards. They weren't just gathering sound bites, they were building a map, connecting one reckless statement to the next, until the picture of a state-led defamation campaign was undeniable. Julian Thorne, the lead counsel, had a habit of pacing when he thought, his shoes tapping rhythmically on the polished floor. While a junior associate, Anya Sharma, scrolled through translated transcripts of Orbán's speeches one night in July, she stopped, pushed her glasses up, and said, "Here, right here. He's used this language before. Enemy of the people, threat to the nation, foreign agent. It's a pattern. He's building his own legal track record of malice." Thorne leaned over her shoulder reading the lines. "Exactly," he murmured. "He's reckless with repetition. And one of these days he'll hand us the perfect trigger." The room fell quiet. Everyone knew what he meant. They didn't have to provoke Orbán, they just had to wait. The preparation wasn't just legal. Strategists at the Open Society Foundations quietly gamed out the optics. They debated the risk of looking like a vindictive billionaire versus the reward of finally taking a firm stand. Late in August, they rehearsed the timing. One staffer said, "If we file within minutes, it shows we were waiting. If we wait a day, it feels like a reaction. The sweet spot is right after, close enough to sting, but fast enough to prove this isn't panic." Soros himself wasn't in those rooms every night, but he was briefed in private. He was measured, deliberate. During a secure video call with Thorne, he said, "I want to be clear, Julian. This cannot be about me. It must be about the principle. If a state can use its full power to label dissent as treason, then the concept of an open society is finished. This is about establishing that facts are not subordinate to state power." Thorne replied, "Then we need to be ready the moment he crosses the line from political rhetoric to a direct, actionable accusation." And ready they were. In September, just weeks before the rally, Soros's team finalized the draft complaint. The documents were printed, reviewed, and locked in a fireproof cabinet in the London office. All they needed was the moment. One fresh, undeniable instance of Orbán accusing Soros of a specific criminal-level act against the state. Everyone knew it was only a matter of time. That night in Budapest, when Orbán gripped the lectern and delivered the lines about Soros being an enemy of the nation, the team's encrypted phones lit up. Within minutes, Thorne was on a secure call with colleagues in London and Brussels. One attorney asked, "Is this the one?" Thorne didn't hesitate. "Yes, file it." What most of the world didn't see was the machinery clicking into place. Clerks at the High Court receiving the electronic submission, assistants double-checking timestamps, a courier on standby. By the time the clip had racked up 1 million views online, the lawsuit was already public record. Inside the office, Anya whispered to a colleague, "People are going to think this was spontaneous." Her colleague smiled back. "Good, let them. It'll make it sting even more." And while all this was happening, Soros was calm. He was in his New York study, reading over market reports, his phone buzzing with updates. His longtime foundation president glanced at him from across the desk and asked softly, "So, it begins?" Soros looked up, a small, almost tired smile on his face. "No, Robert. It began decades ago. Tonight just made it visible." Those words captured the mood. This wasn't a starting point. It was the unveiling of something that had been building quietly, steadily, behind the curtain. Reporters would later piece it together, how meticulous the preparation had been, how every step was mapped out. Some criticized it as political theater. Others praised it as disciplined strategy. But either way, it painted Soros not as reactive, but as a man playing a longer game, waiting for the right time to call the bluff. But while Soros's team had the plan and the paperwork, it was the media storm that followed, which turned a legal case into a global obsession. By sunrise the next day, the lawsuit was the lead story in nearly every newsroom from Lisbon to Warsaw. Global networks rolled out dramatic graphics. National anchors in Rome, Madrid, and Stockholm opened their broadcasts with the same stunned tone. George Soros has filed a $100 million defamation lawsuit against a sitting head of government, Viktor Orbán, just seconds after a video of the Prime Minister's remarks went viral. The timing was irresistible. Newsrooms love symmetry, and this one had it. 22 seconds after Orbán's accusation, Soros's legal hammer dropped. On BBC World News, a host looked straight into the camera and said, "We've seen political rivalries before, but never a sovereign leader and a global private citizen in a legal showdown like this. The speed, the preparation, the sum of money, this is unlike anything we've witnessed." Meanwhile, CNN International brought on a roundtable of analysts. One, a veteran Queen's Counsel barrister from London, leaned forward and told the panel, "This wasn't spontaneous. This was tactical. They had the paperwork locked and loaded, and Orbán, being Orbán, walked straight into it." The clip of her words was replayed on TikTok, spliced with footage of Orbán on stage, followed by the sound of a gavel slamming down. But the media frenzy wasn't just what happened in front of cameras. In the newsroom of Le Monde in Paris, phones rang non-stop as reporters tried to confirm whether the lawsuit had really been prepared weeks in advance. Call-in shows across the UK lit up. One man said, "Soros just played chess while Orbán was playing to the crowd." Another shot back, "This is an attack on a sovereign nation by a globalist billionaire. Nothing will come of it." The arguments weren't new, but the energy was. On social media, the narrative split in two. Pro-Soros accounts, largely from liberal and centrist circles, cheered the boldness, framing him as a defender of democracy. Pro-Orbán accounts, amplified by nationalist movements across Europe, mocked the lawsuit, calling it desperate. The hashtags #SorosStrikes back and #StopSoros trended side by side. A Euronews affiliate sent a camera crew to a pub near the port of Rotterdam. The footage captured real voices. A bartender wiped down a counter while saying, "I've heard politicians blame him for everything for years. It's not just talk anymore, is it? It's action. Soros is showing you can't just say whatever you want without paying for it." At a corner table, two men argued. One said, "This is political theater. Soros doesn't need the money." The other leaned in, shaking his head. "It's not about money. It's about truth. My kids hear this stuff on the internet. If state-sponsored lies go unchecked, they start to sound like facts." Even late-night comedians couldn't resist. On his show, Graham Norton quipped, "Viktor Orbán called George Soros an enemy of the state," and 22 seconds later, Soros said, "I'll see you in court." I haven't seen someone regret their words that quickly since I asked my aunt if she was pregnant. The audience roared. By evening, Bloomberg was analyzing what a $100 million payout would mean for Hungary's already strained budget. Legal experts debated whether Soros could win. Some said yes, pointing to the pattern of state-led campaigns. Others said the bar for defamation against a head of government is notoriously high. Still, the spectacle couldn't be denied. Soros wasn't chasing headlines. Headlines were chasing him. In London, a reporter stood outside the Royal Courts of Justice and delivered a live shot, holding the thick stack of papers. "It's rare to see a case move this quickly," she said. "But make no mistake, this document is real. This isn't posturing, it's litigation." And that word, litigation, cut through the noise. This wasn't a Twitter feud or a parliamentary brawl. This was about to become part of the judicial record. But outside of the media circus, what really mattered was how ordinary Europeans felt. While anchors and analysts dissected every angle, the real pulse of the story was in the streets and workplaces across the continent. In Warsaw, at a small electronics shop, the television replayed the viral clip. The cashier, a man in his late 40s, muttered, "You can't just say things like that about people. There has to be a line." A customer responded, "In politics today, lines don't exist anymore." The cashier shrugged. "Maybe that's the problem. Maybe this is what it takes, someone saying enough." Conversations like that played out everywhere. In Berlin, at a bustling late-night shop, a university student looked up from her phone and said, "This feels different. He's not just issuing a denial, he's dragging a prime minister into an English court. That's serious." Even among Orbán's sympathizers, there was a grudging respect for the move. A retired civil servant in Lisbon told a local reporter, "I don't agree with Soros's politics, but when a government accuses you of being an enemy of the nation, you have a right to defend yourself." At a taverna in Athens, a waitress poured ouzo for a table of men debating the news. One said, "It's about time someone stood up to these strong men. They've been saying wild things for years." Another shook his head, "But suing for 100 million? That's overkill." The waitress chimed in, "It's not about the money. It's about saying truth matters. If leaders can just lie with no consequence, what are we teaching anyone?" The table went quiet. That pause, that moment when people had to think, was exactly the shift Soros's team was counting on. The reaction wasn't just about opinions, it was emotional. For many, the lawsuit carried a sense of relief, like someone had finally stood up to the chaos. For others, it sparked frustration, a belief that the fight would overshadow real issues. But either way, it had people talking. It sparked frustration, a belief that the fight between Soros and Orbán would overshadow real issues. But either way, it had people talking, arguing, debating, reflecting. In Lyon, a history teacher named Mistress Dubois asked her civics class to write down their thoughts. One student wrote, "Leaders should have consequences, like everyone else." Another scribbled, "This is just more fighting between the powerful. Europe needs unity." Miss Dubois collected the papers, thinking about how a clash between a world leader and a global citizen had now become a lesson in her classroom about accountability and democracy. The reaction stretched far beyond political lines. In suburban Milan, a retired doctor named Elena shared her thoughts with a local TV crew. "When you've spent your life teaching your children not to lie, not to bully, and then you see leaders do the opposite, it feels like everything is upside down. Soros filing this case, it tells our children that even powerful people can't get away with everything." Her words went viral, reposted with the caption, "An Italian nonna gets it." At the same time, Orbán's supporters dug in. At a rally in Debrecen just days later, a man holding a Fidesz party banner shouted to a reporter, "Soros thinks he can silence a nation with his foreign lawyers? Well, good luck. We are not scared." Cheers rose from the crowd, but even there, the shadow of the lawsuit loomed. For years, Orbán's insults were seen as red meat for his base. Now, with a lawsuit attached, every word carried new weight. Across the EU, polls showed something unusual. A small but significant percentage of centrists began siding with Soros on the matter, not because they suddenly admired the billionaire, but because they valued the principle of the rule of law over nationalist rhetoric. A focus group in Brussels revealed that many participants, while skeptical of both men, said things like, "At least Soros is forcing the issue of truth." The public reaction wasn't uniform, but it was loud, messy, and real. And in that noise, one thing became clear. Soros's gamble had already changed the conversation, but if the public's voice was beginning to sway, Orbán's inner circle was already gearing up for a fight, scrambling to craft a defense. The mood inside the Prime Minister's offices in the Carmelite monastery in Budapest was anything but calm. The morning after the lawsuit was filed, phones buzzed nonstop. Ministers and advisors barked at one another. Inside a grand office overlooking the Danube, Orbán, his face a mask of cold fury, pointed a stern finger at his justice minister, Catalin Varga. 100 million euros, one of them shouted, slamming a hand on the table. "That's not a lawsuit. That's a missile." "You tell them this is an attack on our sovereignty," Orbán commanded. "This is fake. No British judge will dare to rule against a sovereign nation on behalf of this man." Soros is desperate. He knows he is losing the war for Europe's soul. Varga, a sharp-minded attorney, tried to steady her voice. "Prime Minister, it is not an attack. It is a lawsuit. It is filed in London. The claim is defamation, and under their laws, it is serious. You accused a man of treasonous acts on a public stage." Orbán cut her off, his voice rising. "It is what is necessary. The people understand the threat. It is my sovereign right to protect my nation." Silence filled the room. One of his political advisors sighed. "It is not a sovereign right if it's provably false. That's the problem. They set a trap, and you walked right into it." Orbán's eyes narrowed. "No, he walked into mine. We will turn this around." Within hours, Orbán's ministers were dispatched to state media and friendly outlets. On Hungarian state television, the foreign minister declared, "This is political theater. George Soros is using foreign courts to silence a democratically elected leader and interfere in our internal affairs." The clip was replayed all day, but not without pushback. On a panel on France 24, a political analyst retorted, "If it's political theater, it's the most prepared theater I've ever seen." Soros's team was ready with documents and legal arguments before the prime minister even left the stage. Behind the scenes, Orbán's lawyers scrambled. Denise Callahan, his international counsel, pressed her case in the war room. "If we claim this is protected speech under sovereign immunity, we risk the judge compelling discovery. They'll dig into everything. Every past statement, every government-funded billboard campaign. Do you want that?" Orbán waved her off. "We fight. That's all the people want to see. Fight." Meanwhile, wealthy industrialists with close ties to the government grew anxious. One called an aide directly. "Look, I will continue to support the party, but if this drags through the courts in London, where is my money going? To legal fees or to building the country?" At a rally in a provincial city days later, Orbán faced the storm head-on. "George Soros!" he boomed to the roaring crowd. "This foreign speculator thinks he can scare me with a lawsuit. 100 million euros. Can you believe it? It's ridiculous. I have been speaking the truth about the threats to our nation my whole life, and now he wants to shut me up. But we will not be silenced, will we?" The crowd shouted back, "No!" "They call it defamation." Orbán leaned on the podium, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial growl. "I call it patriotism. They want to control what you say, what you think, what you believe, and we are not going to let them." The crowd erupted, but political strategists watching at home weren't impressed. On BBC Newsnight, a European policy expert remarked, "He's trying to frame it as a defense of the nation, but English law doesn't work that way. You can't accuse someone of specific criminal conduct without evidence. That's not opinion, that's a statement of fact, and it's false." Inside Soros's camp, the reaction to the rally was measured. Julian Thorne told his team in London, "Let him yell. Every word makes our case stronger. The more he insists, the easier it is to prove reckless disregard for the truth." The contrast couldn't have been sharper. One man shouting from podiums, the other quietly building a legal wall around his reputation. But just as Orbán's team tried to regain control, Soros himself finally broke his silence. For days, he had let his legal team carry the weight. Reporters clamored for a quote, but he stayed quiet. The silence itself became news. That question was answered on a Thursday evening at the London School of Economics, where Soros, an alumnus, had been scheduled for months to give a lecture on the future of open societies. The auditorium was packed with students, academics, and journalists itching for more than a talk on political theory. When Soros stepped to the podium, he waited for the applause to die down before leaning toward the microphone. "I came here tonight to talk about the structural challenges facing democracy," he began, his voice dry and academic. "But I know some of you may be interested in a more practical application of that theme." A ripple of laughter broke the tension. He paused, his tone shifting, becoming steady and serious. "In an open society, we argue. We disagree. That is the engine of progress, but disagreement is different from demonization. Political debate is different from state-sponsored defamation." The room grew still. When a government apparatus stands on a stage and calls a private citizen a criminal, an enemy of the state, without a shred of evidence, what they are really saying is that the state is the sole arbiter of truth, that facts are optional. And if we let that stand, if we shrug and say that's just politics, then we are accepting that lies are a legitimate tool of governance. And I cannot accept that. The crowd broke into firm applause. Soros continued, setting aside his prepared notes. "I have spent much of my life arguing that words and ideas matter, that they can build open, tolerant societies, or they can build walls of fear and hatred. This lawsuit isn't about a number on a page. It's not about money. It's about whether we still believe that words have weight and that facts have meaning. The room erupted again, but Soros held up his hand. Now, I know some will say this is personal, that it's just another feud in a world already tired of feuds. But I want you to hear me clearly. This is not about personalities. It is about precedent. If a lie is told by a state loud enough, long enough, and often enough, people start to mistake it for the truth. And when that happens, democracy suffers. Outside the university, small groups of protesters gathered, some with Hungarian flags, others holding signs supporting Soros. Their chants overlapped, creating a chaotic soundtrack to the evening. Inside, Soros concluded, "I don't expect everyone to agree with me. That is the point of an open society. But I do expect that we can tell the difference between a disagreement and a lie. And if it takes going to court to remind people of that difference, then so be it." The applause this time shook the auditorium. After the event, microphones crowded him. One reporter called out, "Mr. Soros, do you think you'll win?" Soros stopped, looked directly at the reporter and said, "I think the truth will win." Then he ducked into his vehicle, leaving those 5 words to echo across every network. That single phrase became the headline, "The truth will win." Financial papers and news channels ran it in bold letters, splashing it across their front pages and home pages worldwide. Across front pages and within hours, it was trending worldwide. In Stockholm, a mother showed her teenage son the clip and said, "That's how you fight back. Not with yelling, not with insults, but with conviction." On the other side, Orbán's supporters scoffed. A host on a nationalist podcast based in Poland said, "The truth will win sounds nice, but it's naive. Courtrooms aren't about truth. They're about lawyers." Still, even among skeptics, Soros's calm, academic delivery stood out. He hadn't insulted Orbán. He hadn't raised his voice. He framed the battle as something larger than himself, something every citizen of a free society had a stake in. But even as Soros spoke with poise and principle, the gears of the legal system were beginning to turn, pulling both men toward a courtroom showdown unlike any Europe had ever seen. The lawsuit had been filed, the public statements made, but now the fight shifted into a slower, heavier rhythm, the rhythm of the courts. For all the shouting at rallies and polished sound bites, the real battlefield became stacks of paper, motions, and hearings at the Royal Courts of Justice in London. Clerks wheeled in carts filled with documents bearing both men's names, the seal of the court, a quiet reminder that this wasn't just politics anymore. It was history being written in legal ink. Judges and clerks whispered about the surreal nature of the case. "A sovereign prime minister versus a billionaire," one bailiff muttered. "Never thought I'd see it." Orbán's attorneys moved first, filing a motion to dismiss on the grounds of sovereign immunity. His King's Counsel barrister argued that the comments were political speech protected by the principle that a British court has no jurisdiction over the official pronouncements of a foreign head of government. But Soros's team was ready. Julian Thorne filed a response so thorough that legal analysts later called it a blueprint. His argument was simple. Sovereign immunity does not provide blanket protection for defamatory statements that cross a border and cause harm in another jurisdiction, especially when they accuse a citizen of criminal acts without evidence. No one, not even a prime minister, is above the law when their words cause tangible reputational damage internationally. Legal analysts on the BBC and in newspapers like The Times broke down the filings. On one network, a commentator pointed to a section of Thorne's brief. "This is where the case gets its teeth. He's showing a pattern of a state-led campaign, not a one-off insult." Meanwhile, law schools across Europe turned the case into a live classroom. At Heidelberg University in Germany, a professor projected the complaint on a screen, telling his students, "This is what international law looks like in practice." Behind the scenes, both camps worked late nights. In Budapest, government advisors worried not just about the legal fight, but the potential diplomatic and financial fallout. Oligarchs with ties to the government began quietly asking whether their investments would be safe if the state was seen to be losing a major international legal battle. In contrast, Soros's circle treated the buildup with discipline. Meetings in London were quiet, structured, and focused on evidence. Anya Sharma, the young associate, spent hours cross-referencing transcripts of Orbán's speeches, highlighting every repeated use of words like enemy and threat to the nation. Every instance strengthened their claim of a malicious campaign. And then, just when people thought the case might drag into endless motions, a sudden turn shifted the momentum. It started with a leak. A sealed document found its way into the hands of an investigative journalist collective in Amsterdam. The file contained internal memos from Orbán's legal team. One lawyer warned in blunt language, "If this case proceeds, the judge may rule against our claim of immunity. This would force discovery, and the Prime Minister's entire history of statements against Soros will become admissible evidence, creating exposure far beyond the rally remarks." The memo was devastating. Within hours, it was published online. At a pub in Dublin, a group of friends passed a phone around their table. One man tapped the screen. "See, even his own lawyers know he's in trouble. They can't spin their way out of this one." The impact wasn't just reputational, it was financial. Several EU-based corporations with investments in Hungary quietly paused future plans, citing geopolitical risk. For the first time, Orbán's circle looked rattled. Meanwhile, Soros's team capitalized on the momentum. Thorne scheduled a press conference on the courthouse steps in London. He didn't gloat. Instead, he held up a single sheet of paper, the leaked memo, and said calmly, "This speaks for itself. Our position has always been that reckless allies have consequences. The defense's own words confirm it." His quiet confidence contrasted starkly with Orbán's angry speeches. Orbán responded the only way he knew how. At a press conference in Budapest, he thundered, "Fake leaks! They're making it up! Soros is behind it! A total setup!" The crowd of loyal journalists applauded, but the story was already out. Weeks later, during a preliminary hearing, a high court judge in London denied Orbán's motion to dismiss. The ruling was clear. While the court recognizes the principle of sovereign immunity, it does not grant a head of government license to make unsubstantiated allegations of criminal conduct that cause reputational harm within this court's jurisdiction. The plaintiff has sufficiently pled a claim for defamation. Courtroom observers gasped. Headlines blared, "Case moves forward." The ruling electrified Europe. Then came the financial shockwave. Bloomberg broke the story that the lawsuit had already forced the Hungarian government to allocate millions of euros to a legal defense fund. The headline read, "Hungary's legal troubles deepen as Orbán faces London trial in Soros suit." That financial pressure changed the narrative. No longer was the lawsuit just about words. It was about survival. The combination of the leaked memo, investor retreat, and the judicial ruling painted a grim picture. Public opinion polls shifted further. In Prague, a factory worker summed it up to a local station. "Orbán's always acted like nothing could touch him. But this is touching him. This is real." The turning point wasn't a fiery speech. It was paper, money, and cold legal reality. As the weight bore down on Orbán, Soros's side began shaping the bigger narrative, what the case meant for the country's understanding of truth and accountability. By the time winter crept in, the lawsuit had become part of the European conversation. In December, another hearing packed the London courthouse. Reporters jostled for position. Inside, Soros sat quietly beside his attorneys, his face calm. Orbán, as a head of state, was absent, but his government's legal representatives filled the benches, whispering frantically. But his lawyers filled the benches, passing notes frantically, their whispers carrying through the courtroom. At one point, Julian Thorne rose and addressed the court. "My lord, this case is not about political rivalry. It is about the misuse of state power to broadcast defamatory lies across borders. Words that accuse a man of crimes he never committed. Words spoken without evidence, repeated for political gain and applause. We ask this court to affirm a simple principle, that truth is not negotiable and it is not subordinate to political power." His tone wasn't theatrical. It was measured, deliberate. That restraint made it powerful. People in the gallery leaned forward, hanging on his words. Afterward, outside the courthouse, microphones clustered around Soros. For the first time since the filing, He spoke not in a lecture or a statement, but in a candid moment that felt personal. "I did not want this lawsuit," he admitted, his hands tucked into his coat pockets. "But I felt I had no choice. If lies become normalized by the state, if we shrug them off as mere politics, then we lower the bar for every society that is struggling for freedom. I have spent a lifetime watching ideologies built on lies tear this continent apart. I want the next generation to grow up in a world where facts are the foundation of public life. That is why we are here." It wasn't a soundbite, it was a lesson, delivered without polish. And that, perhaps, was why it resonated. In communities across the continent, people repeated his words. The history teacher in Lyon, Miss Dubois, shared the clip with her students, asking them to write essays on why truth matters in a democracy. A university professor in Amsterdam quoted Soros's line in his Sunday ethics lecture, weaving it into a message about honesty in public life. Even skeptics, people who were wary of his financial power, admitted the principle struck a chord. Meanwhile, Orbán's government grew more combative. At rallies, he framed the lawsuit as a globalist plot to silence a sovereign nation. Yet each outburst only fed into Soros's argument that reckless words have consequences. Each time Orbán repeated the accusations, pundits shook their heads and said, "He's digging himself deeper." By January, polls across the EU showed a rare consensus. A majority of Europeans, including centrists and even some conservatives, sided with Soros in the lawsuit, not because they suddenly embraced his politics, but because they saw in his actions a principle they wanted to protect. One pollster in Brussels explained it, "It's not about left or right, it's about accountability." The case had not yet gone to trial, but the cultural verdict was already forming. Soros had managed to shift the narrative from a personal feud to a global principle, the rule of law versus the rule of a strong man. The €100 million figure still loomed large, but most people understood the money was symbolic. What mattered was the message. Truth has value, and state-sponsored lies carry a cost. Back in London, as he left a private meeting with his legal team, Soros stopped to greet a small group of supporters waiting outside in the cold. One man, wrapped in a heavy scarf, shook his hand and said, "Thank you, sir, for reminding us that words still matter." Soros gave a small smile and replied, "They always have. We just forget sometimes." That exchange was small, quiet, almost invisible compared to the roar of rallies and cable news debates, but it carried the weight of everything the lawsuit represented. In the end, the story wasn't about a billionaire and a prime minister trading blows. It was about what their clash revealed. That even in an age of division, people still hunger for honesty, for integrity, for leaders who treat words not as weapons, but as promises. And that is the bigger lesson. In politics, in business, in life, words shape reality. They can tear down or build up, deceive or guide, mislead or enlighten. When spoken carelessly, they leave scars. When spoken truthfully, they lay foundations. So whether you're a world leader or just someone talking at the dinner table, remember this: your words carry weight. They matter more than you think. And if you've followed this story and believe that truth still deserves a place in our conversations, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because we'll keep telling stories that remind us through conflict, through struggle, that accountability and honesty still matter. The truth will win.